When most Americans hear the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, it usually is in reference to combat exposure. As our nation has been in a perpetual state of war since 2001, it's easy to rationalize the importance of prioritizing PTSD derived from combat versus child or sexual abuse or physical abuse, terrorist attack, sexual, physical assault, serious accident, and natural disasters that occur outside of combat. Unfortunately, many U.S. military personnel, like people worldwide, have some stress-related reactions after a traumatic event. Fear, sadness, guilt, anger, and sleep problems are very common. One may even have bad memories of the event. If your reactions don't go away over time and they disrupt your life, you may have PTSD. I want you to picture the following three situations. The year is 1982, and a 4-year-old boy watches his brothers play Monopoly with friends when a man less than 15 feet away shoots another man in the face with a shotgun, killing him instantly. The year is now 2001, and a 23-year-old corporal in the Army National Guard is driving home to celebrate the 4th of July when his car hydroplanes, hits 2 trees, and knocks him unconscious for 45 minutes. It's now June 2015. A man, his wife, and 2 young sons are headed to Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida for a family vacation, when the man is bombarded with text messages and phone calls from family and friends saying his older brother had been murdered back home. What do these 3 situations have in common, you might ask? They're about me and about my family. Good afternoon. My name is Moses Thompson, and I, like many others in the U.S. military, suffer from PTSD, but not exclusively from our combat experience. I am providing my example as a testament to my empathetic military civilian leaders and mentors who've motivated and challenged me throughout my career. I call on my fellow CGSC students to take my story and this discussion to their next duty station, as they'll likely have service members in their unit with similar issues. In his article, How PTSD Became a Problem Far Beyond the Battlefield, Sebastian Junger of Vanity Fair wrote about how 35 years after acknowledging the PTSD problem in its current form, the American military now has the highest PTSD rate in its history, and probably in the world. Although horrific experiences are universal, the long-term impairment from them is not. And despite billions of dollars spent on treatment, half of our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have applied for permanent disability. Of those veterans treated, a third have been diagnosed with PTSD. Junger further explained that though only 10% of American forces see combat, the U.S. military now has the highest rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in its history. While evidence exists of service members feigning PTSD, this is not the majority. A 2007 analysis from the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council found that statistically, people who fail to overcome trauma tend to be people who are already burdened by psychological issues, either because they inherited them or because they suffered trauma or abuse as children. According to statistics published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology in 2000, if you experienced the death of a loved one or even weren't held enough as a child, you are up to 7 times more likely to develop the kinds of anxiety disorders that can contribute to PTSD. If you have an educational deficit, if you are female, if you have a low IQ, or if you were abused as a child, you are at an elevated rate of developing PTSD. These factors are nearly as predictive of PTSD as the severity of the trauma itself, according to a 1989 study in the British Journal of Psychiatry. I wish I had this information years ago. I always thought certain people were prone to issues in their lives. For me, issues were numerous throughout my life. I couldn't speak until I was 4. I witnessed my mother physically and emotionally abused. My siblings and I were physically abused. I thought everyone went through what I went through. Well, everyone hasn't experienced extremely traumatic and stressful situations in their lives that directly affect their day-to-day activity. But many members of the military have these experiences. Those experiences are like scabs, and combat tours serves as hands, reopening those long ago covered wounds. As more and more military members have been diagnosed with PTSD, the Department of Defense, or DoD, Department of Veterans Affairs, or commonly known as the VA, and the U.S. military services have dedicated millions of dollars to establishing and supporting PTSD treatment. While this continued focus on PTSD treatment has been immensely appreciated, it's mostly focused on trauma and stress from combat experiences. Those experiences, while hard to treat, are multiplied immensely for someone who experienced PTSD as a child or prior to joining the military. I'll give a quick example. My brother Jeremiah, he is a retired Navy Petty Officer First Class, or an E6 for any military folks not familiar with the Navy's rank structure. He was the bully pacifier growing up, the guy who actually looked for bullies to beat up. He was fearless. He was the best athlete in the family, great at all sports, but his sport of choice, basketball. Now, we grew up in a rough part of uptown New Orleans, in the 10th and 11th wards, respectively. So we saw violence firsthand. Friends shot in front of us, being robbed with a loaded weapon pointed at your face, family members shot and killed. Neither myself or my brothers joined the military to kill people or for an adventure. Our adolescent years were pretty much eventful enough. Jeremiah joined the Navy because he wanted to see the world. In 2012, for some reason, he decided to volunteer for a deployment to Afghanistan, supporting the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Farah. I warned him that ground combat deployments were totally different from the Navy cruises and support missions he was accustomed to during his Navy career. When Jeremiah redeployed in 2013, I saw a change in his demeanor. He was extremely cautious and distant. He had bought his first gun and could not sleep with his bedroom door closed. After a few months, I sat down with him and discussed his deployment experience. He said the attacks on their compound brought back memories of isolated violence we lived through as kids. And I thought about one of my favorite books, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. I am not complaining, nor am I protesting either. It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves. While Mr. Ellison was illustrating the plight of Black Americans in the mid-20th century in his novel, Invisible Man, many U.S. service members suffering from PTSD outside of combat, they feel invisible as well. In his article on PTSD outside of combat, Junger discussed the potential for greater stresses on a person in isolation. He described how modern soldiers return from close-knit combat environments back into, quote, a society where most people work outside the home. Children are educated by strangers. Families are isolated from wider communities. Personal gain almost eclipses collective good, and people sleep alone or with a partner. According to noted Dutch social psychologist Gert Hofstede, in individualist societies, people are only supposed to look after themselves and their direct families. I would expand Hofstede's optic to include people who look similar and share similar values. U.S. service members see their fellow unit members as family, and this sentiment is increased exponentially in combat environments. Unfortunately, our society has to identify specific service members to serve as the face of wounded warriors and those with PTSD. But thousands more out there in our society in pain, suffering, whether it be from their own personal trauma and stress or observing a battle buddy going through their own personal hell and feeling powerless. As CGSC is a hub for joint force interaction, I implore my fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard members to promote community healing within our armed forces. Many of your subordinate personnel may feel alienated from their unit, the military, or society as a whole. One of our jobs as leaders include fostering empathetic work environments. Our armed forces have been in a state of continuous combat for over 15 years. Many service members are hurting and suffering, but feel they'll be ostracized if they speak on trauma and stress they've carried around for a lifetime, but have compartmentalized it, thinking it will never see the light of day. In closing, I challenge my fellow CGSC classmates and the leaders of our armed forces. Don't ignore service members who show signs of trauma and stress that isn't related to the loss of a limb or the loss of a battle buddy in combat. War and combat are not the only places where trauma and stress occur. My brother Jeremiah and I are a testament to the effectiveness of improved DoD and VA care for service members with PTSD, but more importantly, to the effectiveness of supportive leaders, mentors, our sailors and soldiers, family and friends who form our collective village. They say it takes a village to raise a child. I say it takes a military to care for a service member. Thank you.